China, English, Education by Sean McHugh, May 2026. Part 3 of 5. At the second Nanjing contract, when organizing an extracurricular seminar in the humanities, I was told there were currently external inspectors visiting the university, so it'd be best to wait until they were gone. Quality presentations with critical thinking values and widening horizons that indicated the department as a stimulating intellectual environment for the students would be disconcerting and problematic for the inspectors, looking only for streamlining with state directives and uncritical socialist values. Then, at Nanning, I arranged a staff research seminar to present a paper in preparation for a forthcoming academic conference abroad, emailing 23 foreign staff with masters and doctorates, where at first many expressed enthusiasm, but then none came in, being worried about breaking the norms against critical thinking, and the environment instead being all superficiality and bubblegum. Most university departments anywhere, indeed, are fake in terms of genuine inquiry, criticality, and personal interest, with people instead selected for accepting containment inside established and approved paradigms and conforming to expectations. So once the club environment for an academic contribution and peer approval is taken away, then motivation can drop down to zero. In the existing Western academic system, instead of values of truth-seeking that also bring people of every level forward, there is intellectualism for its own sake, where the existing ideas of approved club members are shuffled around in a peer review process for articles written. Jobs, careers, and club membership mean groupthink and sky castle theorizing over insight and truth. Most academics anywhere are driven by regular, simple material motives, not any personal enthusiasm nor intuitive insight in their subject. While the whole academic system in the West and China, in both the social and often natural sciences, selects for those regurgitating sets of presuppositions and for weaker minds looking for identification with a clubby social tier. Real thinking and radical critique of established ideas are curbed by this selection process to the protection of elite power and privilege out in society. There are various English events organized, but native speakers are usually excluded from their preparation, either out of the Chinese staff not seeing the need or out of fear of them pointing out changes and hence disruption needed. At such events, even the best English students, including those taking the International English exam, think it perfectly fine to dash off gibberish to read publicly to hundreds of people, with no need at all for a native speaker to check it first. Everything stays securely superficial and neurotic, at least for Westerners observing, and with only a few decorous and approving comments at the end of the event requested from them. Sometimes speaking by reading is easier than freely speaking from notes as learned ideas, but they don't understand that in English, good writing to read is more complex and has a higher density than good free speaking, while this contrasts with Chinese writing being simpler and in a closer parallel with speaking. They think English writing is arbitrary, without important form, and have no idea it needs careful checking by someone skilled, whether the writer or another, to be at a high standard before it's read, or it won't be understood, and instead will be ridiculous and foolish. There's a raft of stupid, entrenched Chinese English errors across the country, informed by their own language and culture in sequestered ignorance of the rest of the world. While the intransigence reflects both past national mismanagement and an impaired purchase on external reality, a more conscious, critical mind would pause and investigate to check if their assumptions and practice are correct. But in the socialist paradise, with the background organizational system necessarily right and the individual barred from checking for objective standpoints beyond it, even their use, howsoever it stands, of foreign language imports is likewise deemed given. Universities and schools organize regular English public speaking competitions, with native speakers invited to join the judges panel, but usually having no prior input. I have a keen personal interest, having been a British Speakers Club member for several years, then developed and run training courses in the China contracts and leading meetings on 500 occasions. Unfortunately, there's a grotesque national practice of requiring the students to memorize verbatim their speeches, of unchecked and necessarily poor English, again in ignorance of its implicit written complexity that needs to be correct, especially for public use, providing a ridiculous waste of time and energy. The underhand and deliberate intention is to cause stress and discomfort and abolish any enthusiasm the speaker had while issuing given speech topics that stay within approved artifice and praise for aspects of socialism. Speaking with individual self-expression to a group has great potential danger for the existing wider system, so it is introduced to the young and utterly corrupted in the hope that they'll stay away from it in the future. In public speaking, a text can be carefully prepared, but then only the content, information, ideas, or meaning are learnt in abstraction, so that it's given in words freely improvised and explained at the time of the speech as the ideas come to the speaker's mind, all as in normal speaking, and hence giving the results natural liveliness, communication, and rapport with the audience. Accompanying slides are then used as prompts to glance at, where content is memorized against them, and which also automatically remember the speech structure for the speaker. When high formality or accuracy is an issue, or the speaker has lower skills in the language, then speeches are read, but lower-level speakers shouldn't be in a competition. English writing is a record for inward private study and understanding, and if spoken aloud, its emergent complexity and carefully finished quality create an unnatural density that is more difficult to follow than well-prepared free speaking. Chinese writing, however, doesn't have high orderly polish, and instead compares with casual speaking, as making the Chinese assume that English writing can be memorized verbatim with the same results as there would be for doing the same in Chinese. English writing has exceptional sensitivity to grammar and vocabulary, and with any mistakes, it quickly shifts from difficult to absorb to totally incomprehensible. When a part of free speaking and conversation isn't understood, the listener can ask for clarification, where the speaker repeats the content in different ways as necessary. But when a part of writing isn't understood, the reader can only reread, such that the writing must be accurate and correct to begin with, and anything else is unacceptably bad practice. The writer isn't present there to rewrite their mistakes for the reader after failing to notice them via checking and proofreading properly. The verbatim competitions are to present yet deny the opportunity to speak publicly and presuppose that students are useless quacking ducks, which most but not all are, where there is no preparation beyond moronic parroting and none of the wide set of essential delivery techniques. The events are organized to give young people the worst possible public speaking experience, where their institution-approved double-plus-good duck-speak recitation goes wrong in front of a large audience to cause permanent psychological damage so that they won't do it again. The audience is likewise inculcated into aversion for listening to public speakers beyond government professionals. The desired message is that it's impossible and horrendous, where the environment of support and praise is completely false, with the only underlying concern being crushing of the individual and their ideas not sanctioned by the state. Competition's low-grade, written, memorized English makes the speaker a nobody, saying unintelligible rubbish that no one in the room, including themselves, can understand, and who are due only polite and superficial applause. They can also hardly answer any questions from the judges against their speech because they've spent many days just memorizing it, rather than engaging critically with any material it might have. They have almost no idea of what they've just said, and instead, while still terrified, reply by reverting to the stock of expected formulaic moralizing. Also, the projected screen for use in all contemporary public speaking either isn't used or provides an automatic slideshow of vague general symbolism and drivel, as the disingenuous, fearful powers in charge have another contemptuous laugh. The insanity and grossness of pushing this on their own young in institutions all across the country is on the level of historical Chinese foot binding to deliberately destroy children's feet. The practice further relates to a tradition in political settings of prepared word-perfect presentations to pitifully avoid any displeasure from superiors, and within wider culture relates to the Chinese script and its endless characters to be memorized, as making literacy difficult in reflection of the controls on information and expression. The Chinese script was simplified in the 1950s under communism to promote literacy, but even basic reading and writing remain major and long-term tasks, while characters for more complex concepts or thought don't exist at all, as contrasting with the ready development in phonetic English of hundreds of thousands of words out of developed and articulated sets of roots and extensions. Characters and their meaning are memorized as a whole, in place of breaking words down into a small number of constituent phonetics with clear structure, prefixes, and suffixes, in parallel with memorizing a text verbatim instead of breaking down its content via personal understanding to memorize only in abstraction, and thence for re-expression in any number of ways when the speaker speaks. There are oral literary traditions based on memorization in many undeveloped countries, but China's became continuous with constrictive government and sequestration away from the rest of the world. Universities and schools then provide certificates of uncritical reproduction and sequestration away from the rest of the world. Universities and schools then provide certificates of uncritical reproduction and obsequiousness, where nothing is properly understood, as for induction into society's uncritical hive mind and a counterfeit and bandaged existence devoid of higher human capacities. There are similar strategies in the Western system, but China makes it obvious where the education system parroting also translates to the national imported technology copying. The competition's compulsory topics center on societal respect, loyalty, integrity, gratitude, piety, diligence, optimism, admiration, devotion, benevolence, plus even a sense of shame, or how to please others, where mindless exhortations and examples are expected in making the speech into an instruction for the audience. The tone is, we should do this, we should do that, in acknowledging they have little common sense over how to live for themselves, while deferring to wider authority and boring all concerned. The tones of saying what should be done compare with the ongoing revolutionary fist-in-the-air overtones of the modern state from 1949, all long since totally debunked and outmoded by Western postmodernism and the post-Cold War ideological divide critique. They further compare with the highfalutin overtones of the sound of spoken Chinese, again in expression of inherent features of the people and their culture. The topics are for the first round advanced memorizing, and the second round as freely spoken, but with only a few minutes stifled preparation, and in line with the American Toastmasters format. Toastmasters and speakers clubs were also carefully subverted long ago as risks in terms of leadership training for mass movements. Views to express are preset, with no concern for at least a young Western adult's developing range of interests and ideas, and instead, infantile displays are set up around the hall to presuppose, largely correctly, the speakers having permanently dependent children's mentality. The dogged rubbish language and rubbish content further parallel the poor understanding of English's expressive and articulating powers, and its Western culture's counterpart developmental power. Speaking about the sort of person they and others should be also presupposes no one has anything to say for themselves. There is no autonomy, no differences, no personal achievements from striking out alone, and ultimately no persons, and only the state. For most, there is little consciousness to be crushed, yet values of society over values of individuality remains a huge mistake, as China's modest indigenous insight and innovation still need to rise. The notion of speakers separated from the crowd and providing perspectives not defined in terms of relative relations with others and within existing consensus is opposed to Chinese culture. While Western overarching notions of truth as objective and not determined by what others think and providing for science and the entire modern world have never had a place here. Chinese deference to established authority, coupled with polite reticence towards anyone with good new ideas, are incommensurate with one person publicly expressing their thoughts. Displays of insight, intensity, conviction, or self-projection of any kind is seen as wrong, uppity, disharmonious, against the philanthropic state, and to be apologized for. Public speaking presupposes that individuals have something of significance to say to others, whereas Chinese culture presupposes they don't, and where indeed most Chinese students have no opinions on anything, nor personal interests, and much prefer to look at their little phone all day. For China, anodyne topics, while avoiding all critique and reason-giving, and instead being self-effacing, well-mannered, and upbeat, easily trump inquiry and argument, vigorous debate, and finding truth and reality. Eye contact with audience members is particularly poor, where the focus on remembering words replaces normal looking at listeners as they explain something to them out of their understanding. It again aligns with the culture of submission and benightedly respecting relative power relations as though there's nothing else, rather than a culture of seeking objectivity and truth, and hence with eye-to-eye communication. However, some students, when simple storytelling in Chinese, find a rapport with the audience out of their common values and get into rising lines of humor. Meaningful engagement with the audience is anathema, and instead there is purified waffle with zero dynamism, questioning, or thought-provoking explanation. It's an abhorrent and ludicrous farce on stilts, where all teaching staff in attendance speak publicly daily in their job, and know that verbatim memorization is obviously never done. At the end of one competition, before I refused to attend further and emailed the managers very clearly about it, I gave a few-minute speech as a judge, outlining the issues, with extensive management in attendance before me, but was subsequently ignored. The Chinese are mostly too encultured and stupid to see any problem, while the Westerner contingent is typically spineless enough to keep quiet, continue their surface relationships of lies, and take their money. Of the 25 at Zhuhai, if likewise with simpler minds, none gave outward support to my call to the managers to revise practices, and instead existed in a state of abject personal degradation. Prior to a later competition, they allowed me to give a training session to contestants, but then I found they'd invited speakers only from a previous competition to see me, in ensuring that the forthcoming format wouldn't be altered. Then competition judges' required score sheets are consistently overcomplicated and senseless, again with native speakers uninvolved in their creation, and taken away for others to add up and declare winners, as providing for falsification as might be required. The judges don't convene to select winners, in another example of meetings between peers prevented, and instead structures there to defer to dissociated higher power. My public speaking courses at the later universities following Zhuhai over many years were based on the Toastmasters International format, but augmented, then greatly elaborated, with tuition PowerPoint presentations plus organizational materials. Students were engaged, began learning sharply, corrected mistakes from observing each other, and improved results across a semester, if only occasionally really understanding the techniques well. Students are usually pleased to express themselves, even while topics were initially still often in terms of important existing social values and lessons for life that they can commend to the audience, as contrasting with the Western understanding that someone else telling you what to think or do is ridiculous. The perfect Chinese administration and its menace also translate to a basic reluctance to research and argue through contrasting views for the course audience to think about, and instead to keep to descriptive topics in keeping with anonymous worker bees. The notion of something to discuss and think about that has interest of its own as independent of the state is dubious, extraneous, and subversive, and instead they assume topics need to remain decorous and free of the most remote controversy. Then, regardless of the dismal problems with verbatim memorization at the competitions, the great majority of students on the courses, regardless of second language learning issues, also find the concept of preparing writing, but only learning its content, overwhelmingly difficult, and provide, at best, mediocre results. The endowed consciousness is insufficient to break down thought and arguments and consider within their own minds to create internal understanding, and then speak with the directed intensity and focus of having something to communicate back out. No matter how much and in what ways I explain or exercises I create, virtually nobody understands. The room being full of capable minds in terms of outward intellectuality, but with blank and perplexed faces. They can't subject outward text to inward understanding, as there is little there that can understand. If I ask them to repeat their English speech in free Chinese, there are clearly improvements in explanation with less subdued flatness, but without sufficient command of the process to reapply it in English. They're like a computer which can store a text verbatim, but can't explain it. One strategy, at least for higher-level English speakers, is to get them to write their speech notes file in Chinese so that they have no English to memorize and necessarily have to speak freely in translating, although they also need to be working with English expression and phrasing. However, regardless, they'll typically go away and also write a tract of garbage English to memorize verbatim, while usually keeping it from me, then do their regular idiot parrot act. Meanwhile, their accompanying projected screen images tend to be poorly chosen, low resolution, overlapping, and with a flowery or fancy background, all of which and more I corrected in detail. I further have to urge them to find topics of personal and intrinsic interest to describe, while keeping content mature, while very few can provide the more advanced speech of arguing for and against a viewpoint before coming to a conclusion. Passion in the results, however, was evident when having something to say, and the course was often optional, as helping with motivation and avoiding obligated students. Then, in the question period, there's a reluctance to ask their fellow presenter anything, showing that they'll support someone as part of the group, but not when standing outside of it, with this instead being only for officials in the administration, including teachers, who typically don't take questions. Whereas in Western groups, when prompted, someone will usually offer a question, but in China they won't, regardless of how uncomfortable it gets, and I have to train them on how to look for issues in the speech to create a question on. However, there are challenges for audience members anywhere to speak, while the young don't understand so well the need to say something in social situations to keep them smooth, and paradoxically avoid the disharmony they're worried about. Moreover, the Toastmaster system encourages all members to carry out all of the meeting's roles over time, but students are often confused and perturbed at being the chairperson and introducing the speakers, seeing it as my job and a dire breach of hierarchy, and look to rejoin the herd as soon as possible. It's also not easy for them in a constrained and neurotic institution, away from life, while there seem to be no Toastmasters-type speech training groups in the cities, as likely being discouraged or disallowed. The Zhuhai University had set up one, but the prepared speeches were still thick-headedly verbatim, and where, if they could visit an independent organization, they wouldn't have to believe only me, and could immediately see techniques via other adults working to public speaking goals for a range of professional or other real-world applications. Better experiences, nonetheless, were a debating competition in Chinese by an external group held at the Zhuhai Campus Hotel, and a Chinese language competition at Nanchang, both seemingly involving free speech, if with the usual poor content and delivery skills. Furthermore, at Zhuhai, I requested discussion or a meeting on preparation strategies and feedback for the native speaker lecture series, including for myself, but it was trashed as unnecessary, when was likewise badly needed, and where subsequent weak results provided yet more shoddy and unprofessional treatment for the students. Moreover, several months before Zhuhai, I was traveling in Asia and made my way over with some effort to the campus to sign the contract and do a medical for the work visa, staying in town for several days, where neither the two main managers nor senior English recruiter would have lunch or see me outside the brief office meetings, as keeping their defensive distance even then. However, on that trip, I then visited my former manageress and staff for lunch to the north in Dongying in Shandong. Then there are dubbing competitions comprising film clips in English or other foreign languages they're studying, where students take the role of the characters in reading a transcript or subtitles on the screen, with the original soundtrack turned off. It's not only more downtrodden and meaningless recitation, but the text isn't even by them. Furthermore, at the Zhuhai University example, all but one of the scenes from 14 films shown were for small children, and most of those infantile cartoons, while the other was for early teenagers. The hundreds of critical adult Western films with thought-provoking dialogue are presupposed as non-existent, while again, the quiet intention is both to reflect the inherent average Chinese empty and regressive state and to keep all persons in it as securely as possible. The specious critical thinking university environment is nominally encouraged while being reviled and trounced, with the unstated concern being shepherding of moron masses while degrading anyone better in contempt and fear of the next person as a rival in the real world. Again, when speaking for few moments during evaluation, I outlined some of this best and was denounced by the other Western staff there. Films favored in China are overwhelmingly either for infants or, at best, cartoon, fantasy, and superhero, as extremely simplistic, with zero critical or meaningful content, even although almost everyone says they're for adults. And while foreign films that can be construed as spirited individuals winning over society are particularly restricted. Complexity of any kind in films is lost on them, including interpersonal strategy, intrigue, and deception. And my film course with illustrated lectures analyzing some famous films has them staring in wide-eyed blank fascination. Access to anything audiovisual other than mindless trash is difficult with the internet massively censored, where no matter what is searched on, the listings are at the same offensively retarded level, yet trying to give an impression of variety. Some students nonetheless are skilled at locating downloadable films on the internet that bypass Western copyright protection. Showing scenes from classic sci-fi films in teaching sessions also makes clear the Chinese limitations, as unmoved by imaginative other worlds, inspirational futurism, and the awe of the universe. If there's an explosion, they might look up for a moment from their puerile entertainment phones, but then go straight back down. While the notion of space travel into the unknown doesn't fit into all-inclusive socialism, and at best is seen as a strange novelty. Western artistic achievements generally are beyond their monkey-see, monkey-do modernization concerns, and you have to be kind to them. Taking individual inspiration, as with individual understanding, is irregular under the expected relationship and tight social contract laid out with authority. People are quickly frightened by analysis and detailed explication, and then similarly by far-reaching imagination, as it all being a matter for the government, not them. Chinese ethnic and socialist limitations are at one, where both criticality and inspiration connote troublemaking and dissension, leading to removal from their position in society with its essential benefits. No personal perspective is appropriate unless you're trying to overthrow the government or change society, while the state presupposes its existence beyond its constituent individuals, where only it has independence and volition. Since a society or culture without people is a fantasy, however, and socialism is bunk, the education system provides torrents of lies and manipulated perception to keep the lid on the existing order, with its tensions, problems, and favored elite groups. Society can always get worse and descend into chaos, But likewise, there is always some space to think, speak out, and make changes without being fired, and by contrast, gaining tacit respect. China is the lowest tier in humanity's value pyramid and comprises a huge madhouse of unconsciousness and psychotic loss of contact with reality, while the people still somehow walk and speak. The Chinese have the withdrawn state of mind immediately prior to a sufferer being completely incapacitated in a vegetative state. Lack of student motivation due to institutional passionlessness and detachment from the rest of society, with insufficient connection visible or pursued between the activity going on and their life goals, is a central issue and deliberately kept in place in the West and China. The real intention is to stop all learning in terms of personal perception and critique, then sort people into employment roles and positions of influence, favoring existing groups in a quietly unmeritocratic hierarchy. The fake education system is to promote minds defined by instrumental rationality, where given goals of problem solving or copying can be taken up by them, but not questioned. The selection criteria for society is paradigm working and unquestioning respect, where further insight, criticality, common sense, and the humanity to see truth are irrelevant. The Chinese education system again comes from the West, merely with student hours increased, in compensating their lower levels of insight behind organization, efficiency, and even straight thinking, while they also use Western graduation clothes with the black robe, sash, and square hat, and nothing Chinese. Meanwhile, wedding clothes are likewise Western tradition, although photos in historical Chinese Hanfu clothes may be taken beforehand. All meaningful learning is necessarily student-led, as based on inward motivations of both curiosity and personal edification, plus career and future material aims. Forcing people from without to attend to neurotically repacked curriculum content, in processes intentionally lacking even directed reference to examinations, is a huge lying presupposition that no one can learn for themselves. Education systems are to indoctrinate, then induct the empty-minded somewhere into the prevailing unquestioned background and unfair social order, and confound and waste the mindful. The threat from the young generally is minimized by instilling them with an apathy for personal advancement beyond given options, while in China aligning with the culture's stasis, depthlessness, and artifice. Some teaching rooms, moreover, have an electronic clock in and out device by the door to align with the dreary workplace to come, and their activity of equivalent meaninglessness to the workers. Moreover, Chinese extracurricular activities other than child-level sports are frowned on and not encouraged, and there are no university clubs reflecting normal young Western persons' developing interests, such as for travel, photography, astronomy, history, chess, or anything else, and naturally no politics, including model United Nations, religion, or debating. People meeting together unattended by higher authority is trouble, and universities have no dedicated student union buildings, so they play basketball as promoted on every campus, watch cartoons or simple films, or stay addicted to their phones and infantile games there. Then, at the school, they didn't want me to show the prospective international students famous English films with Chinese subtitles that I bought for them at any point in their regimented day. I was further stopped from showing the small 12-year-olds group there a Star Wars film after lunch in their break, with my supervision. They were excited before being told they had to go to the dormitory as usual to be locked in. Students are led to think they should attend to the classroom scenario as means separated from goals, instead of more directly in terms of what they want to achieve. The secret of learning is to learn for something else, or because you're interested, and not for its own wrong-headed neurotic sake. Groups of students together are only for lectures or seminars to introduce or discuss material, where anything further is fixated nonsense under a hidden agenda from elite background groups. forcing the young together in a room and to keep quiet to study contrivance and weirdness for no clear reason deliberately corrupts both the learning process and socializing skills for what should be a social environment. This is either roughly at one with most students' emptiness and low consciousness, or aggressively attacks the occasional more conscious student's humanity. The system selects for weak managers to side with the corruption, absence of professionalism, and shoveling dirt, at least on the minority, who might otherwise do better in life, while feeling warm inside that students generally scarcely suspect the depths of hate and fear they're treated with. Once the learning process, with its personal autonomy, is deferred to an external source, then that source will have only a contemptuous laugh to the side and pursue its own interests while promoting student containment and acquiescence. Education that isn't mindless parroting can only be gained in the mind's own terms of inquiry, and once people are literate for themselves, then the entire idea of structured teaching beyond an outlined guidance is completely bogus. Institutional sequestration disingenuously creates confusion over life goals, derides learning as personal inquiry, and stunts practical skills and knowledge of life in an all-consuming vortex of revulsion and abuse of others as rivals with potential higher achievement. Western higher education social science courses, assessment at least, is centered on essays written in private time, where the student researches and outlines an area of discussion, identifies a question, and argues through a critical perspective. In China, however, finding out things for oneself, reflecting internally, and taking responsibility are all at odds with both inherent abilities and the social control. People do not think, understand, or have anything to say for themselves. Western academia has the minimum practices of researching and showing awareness of and assessing a comprehensive range of others' arguments and views, where all published articles need to do this. But this is totally against Chinese culture and political society. There is only one official and consensus view on everything to find out about and quack about enthusiastically. And if there is no view, you just keep quiet. Any independently derived views are wrongful and a joke, where the idea that one person on their own could know something independently of the preponderant state is silly. Hence, instead of essays, school-style exams are deployed, comprising simple questions, including multiple choice and true or false, purely to test students' closeness of reproduction of whatever authority says, while following given paradigms and unchallenged assumptions. There's a concern to focus on a narrow range of information, in denial of wider knowledge that creates more genuine understanding. And at Zhuhai, I had to submit special application forms with managerial opposition to use normal Western essay assessment for my American culture course. Also, in attacking personal motivation at university, there are compulsory group study periods, bells demarking teaching periods, stooping staff, students in their early 20s addressing them as teacher, keeping of fluffy pencil cases, and physical exercise courses to defer responsibility even for health. Unbelievably, universities also have Chinese staff assigned to student behavior supervision, when, of course, there's no problem, and can't be, as it's post-compulsory. But it presupposes the expectation of permanent lack of adulthood, and instead the childhood condition and intimate state shepherding. No personal development towards independence is necessary or appropriate, as there is a perfect administrative system to look after everyone, and which indeed has great support. Moreover, a critical perspective on what education systems actually do connotes for most an assessment of the culture or overall way of life, with its network of rationale and norms providing for worldviews and personal identity, where only issues lying above can be addressed. The sound of Chinese, with its 4 tonal inflections, is smooth but colored, and parallels haughty speaking and the culture's affected snootiness. The invariance of delivery and attack, plus stasis over shaping and closure in phrase and sentence, provide for sound stabbing and barking down in monosyllables of the same duration in duple time, particularly in ceremonial speeches. However, the tones are also feminine and sometimes sighing, while many people having conversations together resemble the babble of children's higher vocal cords. Moreover, the difficulty foreigners have in learning Chinese aligns with China's historical isolation. The Chinese English accent is pleasant, although some sounds are difficult for them, including the v, r, and zh, and distinguishing short and long vowel sounds. Very is wary, friend, flend, usually, urally, and plain, plen. Longer words are spoken too quickly in dismissal of the niceties of multisyllabic sound, and aligning instead with detailed personal thought being unnecessary in their whitewashed and groundless imported world. Another odd thing is saying pardon to someone often results in them beginning their whole statement again, and not just the last word they spoke that you didn't understand, and then making it no clearer. With culture and thought superficial, the basic English they want means staying securely with surfaces and learning weak, informal writing and speaking. Textbooks have students practicing speaking words joined together for speed, when instead they need to learn the language as it is, with reference to the spelling that defines it, and from there naturally gain an understanding of shortcuts and various informalities. The Chinese, however, take everything as informal, have no serious understanding of anything, and approach as parrots. The whole society then copies Western technology, with no one understanding what they're doing, while understanding as an individual anyway is opposed to socialist values and state power. Nonetheless, without critical values established in the cultural background, and beyond both right and left-wing versions of majority-rule democracy, society is unstable and only persists by material development coming from elsewhere as having more success with those values. Unclear and inarticulate spoken English fits with the lack of transparency of content in writing, as well as society, where they have nothing to say and no personal opinions in the first place. Speaking without saying anything is praised, while there is pomposity in place of anything deeper to know. The national English language newspaper China Daily, for instance, although grammatically fair, is inanely pretentious, with restatement of official views allied with the usual endemic tautologies, plus simplistic emotional content and padding in place of real discussion. The Pinyin transliteration system includes tonal diacritics and creates letter combination conventions for sounds not in English. Only Chinese speakers can pronounce them, but the phonetics are needed for the words to be typed with a keyboard or looked up on search engines and in dictionaries, although dictionaries exist that list characters by the standardized order of strokes in them. Pinyin is also needed partly for Chinese children learning their own pronunciation by reading in addition to listening, and for foreigners using Chinese, where words can be more easily recognized than the alien and similar block characters. Tonal inflection for expressive effect in English has endless variety, while by contrast, tonal languages, with particular tones given in advance in order to say the words, provide for uniformity of a people's emotions and attitudes, although there is some inflection and movement above the tones, along with audible Western dynamics for conversations' beginnings and endings. People anywhere, particularly when they don't travel internationally, typically underestimate the differences between cultures, with non-Westerners suspecting neither the tremendous accuracy and differentiation nor range and flexibility of expression of English that its open grammar and subtle syntax allows. Unexpected objective rationality then further emerges out of the architectonic closure of stress pattern, phrase, sentence, and paragraph that parallel formal logic, and as underwriting the great European intellectual movements leading to the modern world of the Renaissance, scientific and industrial revolutions, and Enlightenment. English formations also develop out of their context, where their correct use is an issue of pragmatic judgment, as often in contrast to other languages' formations, given by sets of rules, and meaning that their speakers don't appreciate the care and caution required in preparing written English, nor then in the proofreading process, as occasionally requested of native speakers. To be continued. Any questions?